The air in Boston, 1765, tasted of salt and stale beer, but beneath the familiar grime, a newer, more acidic resentment was festering. For Elias Thorne, a master cooper whose hands smelled perpetually of brine and oak shavings, the New World had always been a misnomer. Nothing felt new when the echoes of ancient Europe boomed across the Atlantic, demanding obedience and tribute. He stood in the gloom of his workshop, candlelight illuminating the sweat on his brow as he hammered a final hoop onto a hogshead barrel destined for the king's customs. Elias was a second-generation colonist. His grandfather had fled the religious persecutions of East Anglia, seeking not just land, but release. They had found the land, yes, and abundance of it, but the release proved illusory. The colonies were merely an extension of the mainland's long arm, a dumping ground for its discarded laws and a limitless source for its treasury. "Another shelling, Thorne, for the defense of the bloody empire," muttered his apprentice Finn, a young lad whose youthful bravado hadn't yet been crushed by the grind. He gestured to a newly pasted broadsheet detailing the latest duties imposed by Parliament. Elias grunted, wiping his hand on his leather apron. "Aye, Finn, they call it protection. We call it plunder. They think the sea makes us forget how things work over there, but we remember. We remember the lords, the bishops, the distance between the king and the common man that could never be bridged by hard work alone." He picked up a small, worn wooden carving, a simple, crudely made figure of a man bowed under a great stone. It was a token from his grandfather, a constant reminder of the hierarchical structure they had supposedly escaped. The weight of the old world was not just in taxes. It was in the ingrained belief of inherited authority, the notion that a man born across the sea, simply by accident of birth, held inherent power over a man who had built his life from scratch in the wilderness. This new wave of taxes, the Stamp Act, the sugar duties, was more than just financial hardship. It was a symbolic reassertion of that ancient hierarchy. It felt like the stone in his grandfather's carving was being pressed back onto their shoulders. They had cleared the forests, built the towns, and fought the native tribes, believing every swing of the axe brought them closer to self-determination. Yet London seemed determined to keep them perpetually children, subjects who needed ruling, not citizens capable of governance. Elias looked out at the narrow, crowded street where the familiar faces of merchants, sailors, and laborers moved with a strained urgency. He saw their weariness, their growing indignation. The vast Atlantic could separate the continents, but it could not sever the chain of command, not unless someone decided to break the links themselves. He set down the carving, the wood warm from his palm, and reached for another stave. The king demanded his barrels, but Elias Thorne felt a different kind of structure starting to take shape in the minds of the men around him, a structure built not on deference, but on defiance. The Atlantic was the visible physical chasm separating the colonies from the crown. But as the 1760s wore on, a far more insidious and subtle gap, the unseen divide, began to cleave the colonial society itself, running straight through the heart of families, friendships, and communities. It was a schism based not on geography or religion, but on a fundamental difference in loyalty and worldview. In Philadelphia, the bustling, orderly heart of the colonies, lived Thomas Ashby, a successful lawyer who considered himself a gentleman of the highest caliber. Thomas was fiercely loyal to the crown. His chambers were lined with leather-bound legal texts, many bearing the seal of British Parliament. For him, the king represented order, civilization, and the legal framework that protected his property and facilitated his prosperity. He saw the recent taxes as unfortunate, perhaps clumsy, but ultimately necessary measures to maintain the grand, stabilizing structure of the empire. The Boston rabble and these frontier ruffians are sacrificing stability for sentimentality, he argued to his younger cousin, Samuel, during their weekly supper. Anarchy is a far greater enemy than a shilling on a sheet of paper. We are British subjects. We benefit from the greatest navy in the world and the finest system of law. To tear that down over a matter of economics is madness. Samuel, a surveyor who often traveled between the city and the frontier, saw the issue through a different lens, the lens of the American landscape and its people. He saw the self-reliance of men like Josiah Green and the principled indignation of townspeople like Elias Thorne. He realized that while Thomas revered the idea of the British Constitution, the colonists were already living under a new, unwritten constitution forged in the crucible of their shared experience. "Cousin, you look at the law as it is written in Westminster," Samuel retorted, placing his fork down carefully. "But the people here are writing a new one with their lives. The divide is this: you see yourselves as Englishmen abroad. We see ourselves as Americans. An Englishman bows to a law made without his consent because tradition demands it. An American resists it because experience has taught him he has the right to refuse." This unseen divide was most painfully felt in the drawing rooms in marketplaces, where neighbors began to whisper about one another. Thomas Ashby saw the growing resistance movements, the Sons of Liberty, not as patriots, but as seditious mobs threatening the very fabric of society. He viewed their boycotts and protests as a descent into lawlessness. He began to keep a careful list in his mind of those who attended unauthorized meetings, the loyalists and the patriots, silently calculating the strength of the other side. The gap was subtle. Both men still spoke the king's English, drank the king's tea, though Samuel now preferred local herbal brews, and upheld the common law. But when Thomas spoke of home, he meant London across the sea. When Samuel spoke of home, he meant the soil beneath his feet, stretching from the bustling wharves of Philadelphia to the untamed forests of the interior. This ideological rift, deeper than any river or mountain range, was hardening. It was the crucial, invisible preparation for war. When the bullets finally flew, the men and women who stood on either side of this divide would realize the true tragedy. The enemy was not a distant king, but the neighbor who saw the world and his place in it fundamentally. The arrival of the tea ships in Boston Harbor was not just a commercial event. It was a conversation conducted without words, a demonstration of the silent language of taxation. For the colonists, taxes were no longer merely fees, they were decrees, silent pronouncements of their subservient status. Elias Thorne felt this language acutely. His cooperage business, reliant on international trade, was being choked by the Townshend Acts. It wasn't just a few pence on the imported glass, lead, or paper. It was the mechanism of enforcement. These duties were not intended to regulate trade, but specifically to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. "They are cutting the purse strings, Finn," Elias explained to his apprentice one day, watching a customs officer arrogantly patrol the wharf. "Before, our assemblies paid the governors. We held the power of the purse. They had to listen to us. Now, the king pays them directly from our tax money. The silence is deafening. You no longer control your own government." The silence was also enforced by the presence of the British troops. In the city, the Redcoats were constant reminders that this was not a dispute between equals, but an assertion of imperial will. Every sip of legally imported tea, every document stamped with the crown seal, was an involuntary oath of allegiance. The genius of the colonial resistance lay in their ability to decode and subvert this silent language. They responded with a counterlanguage of non-consumption. The boycott was Sarah Greene's battlefield, far removed from her husband Josiah's frontier. Back in the western settlements, she and other women gathered in spinning bees, transforming it. The prelude. The closing of the harbor was the catalyst. The time for petitioning was over. The era of confrontation had begun. The spring of 1775 was a season of terrifying clarity. The British response to the Boston Tea Party in the subsequent intolerable acts had forced the final, painful choice upon every soul in the colonies, the moment of crossing the Rubicon of loyalty. There was no longer any middle ground between being a subject of the crown and becoming a rebel. For Samuel Ashby, the surveyor from Philadelphia, who had long debated with his loyalist cousin Thomas, this moment came on the road to Lexington. He wasn't a soldier, but his skills with a compass and his intimate knowledge of the backcountry were invaluable to the growing movement. He was now a scout for the militias, riding through the night to warn the populace of the approaching British column marching out of Boston. Samuel had always admired the order and law that the British Empire represented. He saw himself as a moderate, hoping for reconciliation, a true American Whig demanding his rights as an Englishman. But the march of the Redcoats, sent to seize colonial arms and arrest the leaders of the provincial government, was not a negotiation. It was an act of war against his own people. He remembered the fateful ride, the moonlight glancing off the muddy road, his horse's breath steaming in the cool air. When he rode past the sleeping farmhouses, his voice hoarse from shouting the alarm, he wasn't just warning farmers, he was burning the bridge behind him. He was choosing the chaotic, perilous path of independence over the comfortable, stable road of submission. The act of sounding the alarm was his personal Rubicon. Once crossed, there was no returning to the life of a loyal subject. The morning after the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord solidified this irreversible choice. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, erased the nuances of political debate. When Samuel saw the bodies, the faces of ordinary men, like Elias Thorne's neighbors, fallen under the organized fire of the king's troops, the abstract legal arguments collapsed into raw, visceral hatred. The red uniforms no longer represented order, they represented the murder of countrymen. His cousin Thomas, the staunch loyalist lawyer, saw the same blood, but drew the opposite conclusion. For Thomas, the firing upon the British column by the colonial militias was the ultimate, unforgivable crime, treason. He saw the rebels as criminals who had forsaken God and king, sacrificing the entire structure of civilized society for a momentary rage. Thomas had retreated to the safety of the British-occupied city, secretly providing intelligence on rebel movements, believing he was saving the colonies from themselves. The war was no longer an ideological argument between London and the colonies. It was a civil conflict, a battle between two deeply held, mutually exclusive visions of America. The men who had been neighbors in Boston and cousins in Philadelphia were now enemies, armed against one another. The crossing of this Rubicon of loyalty meant that the fight would not end with a negotiated settlement, but only with the complete military victory of one side and the utter defeat or flight of the other. The great experiment had begun, not with a grand declaration, but with a few desperate shots in the pre-dawn.
The victory at Saratoga in late 1777 was not just a military success, it was the diplomatic earthquake that secured the alliance forged in blood. It was the proof France needed that the American cause was not a lost rebellion, but a viable war for independence. The news of the British surrender reached Paris, where Benjamin Franklin, the colony's chief envoy, had been charming and cajoling the French court for months. France, still smarting from its defeat by Great Britain in the recent 7 Years' War, saw a golden opportunity for vengeance and to weaken its old rival. The sheer audacity of the Americans and their ability to capture an entire British army was the final persuasion. The formal treaties signed in February 1778 transformed the conflict. It brought a professional, well-equipped, and immense naval power into the American war effort. But for the soldiers on the ground, the alliance was initially a perplexing, even irritating mixture of cultures. Josiah Green, emerging from the trials of Valley Forge, first encountered the French forces during the movements leading up to the siege of Yorktown. He stood gazing at the unfamiliar uniforms, the dazzling white coats, the meticulous lace, the elaborate plumes that contrasted sharply with the Continental Army's tattered homespun and earth-toned rags. "They look like they're ready for a parade, not a fight," muttered a nearby American soldier, spitting tobacco. Josiah, ever pragmatic, watched the French soldiers drill. They moved with a precision and discipline that surpassed even the rigorous training of von Steuben. "Aye, but their guns fire as straight as ours," he observed, "and their ships are what we truly need." The differences were profound. The Americans spoke of liberty and self-governance. The French spoke of the glory of the king and the necessity of honor. They drank wine while the Americans drank hard cider or whiskey. Their manners seemed alien, their language impenetrable. Yet the common enemy, the British redcoat, was the blood that began to bind them. The true forging of the alliance occurred not in treaties, but in shared hardship. At Yorktown, the final major battle of the war, American and French forces worked side by side, digging siege trenches through the Virginia soil. Josiah found himself working next to a young French engineer, Pierre. They couldn't exchange more than a few words: dig, water, damn British. But they shared the same exhaustion, the same fear under bombardment, and the same desperate desire for victory. When a British cannonball struck dangerously close, showering them with dirt, Pierre simply grinned, spit out soil, and gestured back to work. In that shared, non-verbal moment of peril, the political alliance became personal. It was the French naval blockade, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, that sealed the fate of the British at Yorktown. The final crushing blow delivered by the combined siege forces, the alliance forged in blood, demonstrated that the American rebellion was now an international war, backed by the strength of a global power. The surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown was not a purely American triumph. It was a testament to a coalition secured by the shared commitment and sacrifice of two vastly different nations standing together against a common foe.
Even after the fierce debates were done, the ink had dried, and the government was seated, the most profound flaws in the American experiment remained. These were the shadows on the Constitution, the moral compromises that threatened to undo the entire revolutionary promise of equality. The deepest shadow was slavery. Though Elias Thorne, the staunch Democrat from Boston, championed the Republican ideals of freedom, his success as a cooper often relied on trade that was inextricably linked to the labor of enslaved people in the South. The 3/5 Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, these were not merely political compromises, they were legal endorsements of human bondage, written into the founding document itself. In South Carolina, a young politician named Charles Pinckney, who had championed the interests of the plantation owners at the convention, viewed these clauses not as shadows, but as pillars of economic necessity. He justified the horrific practice by cloaking it in the language of property rights and state sovereignty, arguing that without the institution, the Union would have never been formed. The prosperity of his class was built on the terrifying, absolute dominion over human lives. Meanwhile, the shadow of Native American displacement stretched across the frontier. Josiah Green, the frontiersman, had fought the British, believing he was securing his family's right to their land. But the newly organized federal government, eager to expand westward to satisfy the land hunger of its citizens, adopted policies that systematically dismantled indigenous claims. Treaties were made and broken with ruthless efficiency. Josiah's conscience felt the weight of this moral contradiction. He had fought the British crown for his liberty, yet the very act of settling and securing his land was predicated on denying that same right to the native tribes. He watched as his neighbors grew rich by staking claims on territory newly acquired through coerced treaties. The government that had protected him from tyranny now acted as the primary engine of dispossession for others. The final shadow was the rise of partisan tyranny, a threat to free speech. In 1798, fueled by fear of war with France and intense partisan hatred, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws essentially criminalized criticism of the government. For men who had fought and bled for the right to protest, this was an alarming echo of the British tyranny they had overthrown. Samuel Ashby, the Federalist-leaning surveyor, was stunned. He had defended the Constitution as a safeguard against mob rule, but now he saw the government itself becoming the oppressor. He watched as journalists and political opponents were arrested and jailed merely for publishing dissenting opinions. The laws were clearly unconstitutional, a direct assault on the First Amendment. They revealed that the struggle for freedom was eternal, that the architects of liberty, once in power, could easily succumb to the temptation of suppressing their critics. These shadows on the Constitution, slavery, displacement, and the suppression of dissent were the nation's original sins. They demonstrated that the great founding documents were not flawless tablets of stone, but living, imperfect texts. The revolution had secured the form of self-governance, but the arduous, continuous battle for the soul and full promise of that liberty was passed to the next generation. The revolution had secured the 13 states.
The year is 1820. The original players in the revolution are now grandfathers, their memory sharp, their hands gnarled. The unfinished experiment, the republic they fought and built, has survived its first decades, but it is deeply troubled. It stands at a crucial inflection point where the moral compromises of the past threaten to fracture the future. Elias Thorne, now retired from his coopering business, sat on his porch in Boston, rereading the newspapers. The headlines screamed of the Missouri Compromise. This legislative act, designed to maintain the balance of power between free and slave states, felt less like a solution and more like a temporary bandage over a mortal wound. The question of slavery, the shadow on the Constitution, had returned, angrier and more complex than ever. Elias remembered the words of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. He had spent his life believing in that promise. Now, he saw the government he helped create actively debating how to legally expand the system of human bondage into vast new territories gained by the relentless march westward. "It's a house divided, Finn," he sighed to his aging former apprentice. "We built it on the sand of compromise. We gave them the 3/5 clause to start the Union, and now they demand more territory. The price of that unity is the freedom of millions." On the western fringe, Josiah Green, his family now settled deep in Kentucky, felt the same profound anxiety. His sons, having fought the wilderness and established their farms, watched as the debate over slavery defined their political lives. They were free men on free soil, yet the market prices for their crops were dictated by the labor of enslaved people across the Ohio River. The idealism of the revolution was being drowned out by the noise of sectional self-interest. Josiah found himself despairing that the effort of the architects of a new republic had only deferred the true reckoning. The structural flaw they had built into the foundation was now reaching the rafters. The surveyor, Samuel Ashby, now spent his days